Welcome to Kaleidoscope. Let's talk.
Sea levels are rising, temperatures are rising, and natural disasters are happening more often than ever. We are into an era of climate change. Now, Sri Lanka has not been spared either. We were ranked as the fourth most affected country by climate change and in the top 10 countries most affected by extreme weather. Food security is threatened and rising sea levels too are frightening. Scientist, conservationist, public policy advocate and our regular guest on Kaleidoscope, Rohan Pethiyagoda, checks out the temperature on climate change today. Welcome, Rohan. Lovely to have you on the show again and also chatting with you about a subject that's very close to your heart, climate change. Now, Sri Lanka is among the top 10 countries impacted by extreme weather. Does this ranking actually hold any water?
No. That's an easy one because we simply don't have the data. There aren't even good models that say that in the future we will have substantially different weather patterns going into the next few decades than we have been seeing in the past. Many people like to make this an urgent and immediate issue for this country. It is an issue, of course, for all of humanity, including Sri Lanka. But there is no need for a panic response to this.
So there are two schools of thought. Sri Lanka is in a climate emergency, or that Sri Lanka is not really impacted as much as others in the region.
You have to be careful when you use this word emergency. I don't like it myself. The Secretary General of the United Nations has been telling governments that they should declare emergencies. I think this is fundamentally flawed reasoning for several reasons. One is if there was an emergency, the Secretary General would give up using his private jet. He hasn't. All right. Secondly, the UN has explicit provision in its charter to declare an emergency, what's called known as a level 3 emergency. They have not done so. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the world's supreme body working within the orbit of the United Nations, has not recommended declaring emergencies. And Savithri, you and I know only too well that when emergencies come to be declared in any country, just look at what happened with COVID. It's completely abused by politicians for their own gain. We've never seen human rights violations as we have seen under emergency in Sri Lanka. Our response to climate change is going to have to last the next century, at least the next several decades. You can't have an emergency for several decades. So this is not a sensible approach to the problem. We need a more measured, reasoned approach going forward and not this knee-jerk crisis management kind of mentality.
So what does climate change portend for Sri Lanka?
According to the worst predictions of the IPCC, this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we will see an increase in temperatures by the end of this century of up to 3.7 degrees Celsius. That's quite a substantial increase. It means that the weather in Colombo that we are seeing now will be roughly the weather you'll be seeing in Ginigathena. Right? So Colombo will be substantially hotter and Colombo weather is what you're going to see around Vatavalla, Ginigathena, that region, in terms of temperature. We have no idea what's going to happen in terms of rainfall. There are no good predictions for this at all. I mean, your guess is as good as mine. Perhaps also most importantly, sea level is going to rise by about 2 feet. About 65 centimeters is the prediction. That will definitely happen. That's happening already. And so we have to build resilience in our coastal communities to take care of that because low-lying towns and cities like Mathura, for example, will have flooding events that we have to take care of with civil engineering interventions. Water for Colombo is another problem because the Kalani supplies pretty much all the water for Colombo. And the saltwater intrusion into the Kalani as a result of sea level rise by 2 feet will be very substantial. So this means building a barrage across the Kalani to prevent seawater intrusion and to preserve fresh water. That means flooding a lot of land on either side of the river, in which tens of thousands of people are living, so displacement of people. So, and also an expensive intervention because a barrage of that kind is expensive. But you remember, we have to do this across 103 rivers in Sri Lanka. This is a massively complicated and expensive process we have to do over the next century.
Have we as a nation responded to climate change? What should the national response be?
So I think the national response has to be taken out of politics. That's the most important thing. So I think we need a climate change institution that will manage policy and the whole framework of climate change resilience and response. That is a bit like the central bank, out of politics and certainly out of the political cycle of 5 years. We need to think in the 20 or 30 year time frame. And we already did this once in the case of Mahabali. If you think about it, Mahabali was planned for 20 years before it was rolled out, and it was rolled out over more than 15 years. So we've got experience in doing these kinds of civil engineering interventions on those kinds of timescales, and there's no reason why we can't do it again. The thing is to take it out of the political cycle and place it above, so that even when governments change, policy doesn't change.
So people talk about achieving net zero emissions, becoming carbon neutral. Firstly, is this practical? Secondly, how do we set about it? And thirdly, what's the cost?
So it's eminently practical, but I think you need to start one step before that. Why should we do it? We should do it because we need to be good global citizens. If you think about it, the globe, the rest of the world asking us to do this is completely unreasonable. When we got independence in 1948, 85% of the carbon emissions on the planet were caused by Europe and the United States. Just those two. 15% was the rest of the world. China, India, Brazil, Canada, everybody else, Russia, except Europe and the US. So 85% of the cake had been eaten by them already. Now there's 15% less. And what's the West's message to us now? Oh, we'd like you to share this 15% equitably, not just amongst yourselves, but also with us, please. I think that's a completely unreasonable ask. If the West caused the vast majority of the pollution on the planet, it is their responsibility to clean it up, not ours. And we should, of course, be good global citizens and clean it up and head to net zero, but they should pay for it. Why should we pay for pollution that they have caused? That's completely iniquitous. There's no justice in that. So I would say we have to start at a different place. Countries like Sri Lanka, in my view, should just boycott this whole conference of parties, this COP process, and say, no, we're not even going to come till you show us the money. Because all this rhetoric that is coming from the West is pretty meaningless. Because unless they invest in countries like us transitioning to net zero, it means nothing to us. What's in it for us? We cause a tiny percentage of global emissions. And the cost of transitioning to, even at present day, if we want to transition just our electricity to zero carbon, it will cost us between $40 and $50 billion. Now, that's a massive amount of money for Sri Lanka. And that money is money that we should spend in getting resilience into our economies to face climate change. Because remember, we talked about all the civil engineering about sea level rise. We have to think about hydrology. How do we ensure water security for our cities in terms of urban water supply, in terms of irrigation? How do we ensure agricultural sustainability, that the tea and the rice we are going to grow, for example, in future decades, is going to be resilient to the climates of the future? For that, we have to start investing in science now. So being a good global citizen, in my book, is very much in the bottom of my list of priorities. As a national policy, I think we have to consider our people first, and if the world is willing to pay us to get to net zero, that's fine.
How do we make Sri Lanka resilient to climate change?
The big challenge for us is to invest in doing the research now, at least the demographic research, which are going to be areas that we have to preserve in terms of places that will be affected by sea level rise. So as I mentioned, Matara, Panadura is another place where tens of thousands of people living on the riverbanks who will be affected. How are we going to manage the demographics of this? This needs a lot of planning and study. Secondly, agriculture, as I already mentioned. But the thing is, Sri Lanka has already been a country that led the way in responding to climate over the last 2 millennia, in which the kings of the past built all these tens of thousands of village tanks and reservoirs. And that was a response to climate, response to drought, of storing water, the great Parakrama Bahu philosophy. And we have this intricate network of irrigation systems across the country in our rice bowl, which have given us resilience to climate. We've done it before, so this is not a big ask for a country like us to do. If we plan it carefully and manage our resources as we head into the climates of the future, I don't see us having a problem. Most importantly, I think a lot of the hype is unreasonable and built up by the media. A statistic that I like to give, according to the data of the meteorology department, is that the hottest day in Colombo, do you know what the hottest day in Colombo was? That was the 2nd of January 1889, right? This wasn't last week. And that was 36.6 degrees, anything high, much higher than you and I have seen in our lifetimes. So the media would hype that by having the next hottest day will be reported, for example, the hottest day in the last century. But the hottest day in the last century means nothing, because the hottest day on record was 130 or 40 years ago. So 1889, just think of that period. So I'm not a climate change denier or even a skeptic. This is happening, this is real, and we have to respond to it. But there's no point just throwing your arms in the air and being hysterical like many youngsters in the West are doing. If your response to climate change is throwing soup on classical paintings or pasting yourself to the sidewalk, then I have nothing to say to you, because you're just behaving like a spoiled, ignorant, entitled teenager throwing a tantrum.
Do you think our biodiversity is threatened because of climate change?
Yes, but not in the way that most people would think. 120,000 years ago, we had a really warm period of climate, the so-called last interglacial. And then climate was about 4 degrees Celsius warmer than it is now. And that's about as bad, that's worse than what the IPCC is predicting for 2100. So it was really warm. And sea level was not just 2 feet higher, it was about 24 feet higher. 24 meters, sorry, 80 feet higher, 24 meters higher than it is now. So where we're sitting now is underwater, just 120,000 years ago. Every species that is native to this country now survived that cataclysm, if you will. So they've been there before. So if they could survive it then, they can survive it now. So that's not really an issue. I'm not worried about that aspect of it. The aspect I'm worried about is that as climate warms, species that are adapted to live in, for example, Colombo, would tend to drift upwards because it's cooler as you go up. So it gets about 1 degree Celsius cooler for every 200 meters that you go upwards, which is why Horton Plains is about 10 degrees cooler than Colombo on average. And so species living around Colombo would tend to drift upwards towards Guinea-Athena, for example, by 2100, if those predictions are correct. Now the problem is, how do they drift up? It's very easy to say, they can't fly, because now we've modified the landscape and we've reduced our natural forests into little fragments. So our natural forests exist as little islands in a huge landscape that is modified by humanity in terms of plantations, towns and cities and so on. So the forests that persist still, Singaraja, Kanneliya, Kottava, Hinidoma, Haycock, Peak Wilderness, these are isolated fragments which have no connectivity. So our resilience to climate change will be in part to build connectivity across those habitats. Now we've got a natural opportunity here, because from very early colonial times, the margins of every river have a reservation. It varies depending on the size of the river, but every waterway in Sri Lanka has a reservation on the side. And all rivers flow from the highlands to the sea, to coin a phrase from the Middle East. So from the highlands to the sea, we have the opportunities for connecting habitats along riversides. And reforesting these would be a huge benefit to building biodiversity resilience to climate in the future, because this way we would build a network of forests across the country and also protect our waterways, because this is the best thing we can do for rivers, to prevent erosion and so on into the rivers. So this is a huge opportunity. I like it very much also because almost all the cost goes into labor. So it means into poor people's pockets.
So if you were given the mantle to tackle climate change for Sri Lanka, what are your 3 priorities very quickly?
So first of all, I wouldn't take it because I'm 68 years old, and I think people under 40 should be doing this stuff. I think planning for sea level rise is something that's urgently necessary, because many of our towns, most of our population lives by the sea. So we have to build resilience there. We have to start greenhouse research on agricultural crops, tea, rice and so on, looking at mimicking climates of the future and inventing cultivars that will be resilient and will flourish in those climates. And thirdly, I think we need to pay attention to biodiversity by building the connectivity between the highlands and the lowlands along rivers. I think those 3 are all eminently doable, and we should do them fast.
Let's hope we remain somewhat green, at least in our lifetime and the next.
We will for sure.
Did you know that Kaleidoscope is on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn? Do subscribe and follow us if you'd like to hear more from us.